Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
Thanks for joining us again on the Ducks Unlimited podcast. We have a really exciting episode for you today, and it starts like this. Every year since 1955, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Canadian Wildlife Service, state wildlife resource agencies, and provincial agencies all collaborate to conduct what is formally known as the Waterfowl Breeding Population and Habitat Survey, or as many people will know it, the May Survey. Well, for the first time in its 65-year history, that survey will not occur. It is yet another casualty of the COVID-19 situation in which we all find ourselves. As all waterfowl hunters likely know, these data that are collected from the survey play an integral role in the annual process of setting harvest regulations. And many of you probably saw recent press releases announcing the cancellation of the survey and describing what is expected to happen in its absence. Now, we know there are a lot of questions about what went into that decision and what it means for hunting regulations both this year and into the future. We are extremely fortunate to have as our guest today one of the people near the top of the chain in that decision-making process. Dr. Ken Richkus, the Chief of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Division of Migratory Bird Management, and I'm happy to also call him a longtime friend of mine. Ken, thank you so much for joining us, and welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast.
Thank you, Mike. It's great to be here with you today. God, it just seems like yesterday that you and I were both chasing around pintails and mallards, across Saskatchewan and Manitoba. It's hard to believe that's been, over 20 years now.
I know it. It's fun to reflect on that at times, and hopefully at some point we'll have a chance to do that. But we probably need to talk about the issue at hand today. But before we get into that, I wanted to give you an opportunity to do a brief introduction, a bio of where you are. I've introduced you as the Chief of the Division of Migratory Bird Management, but you've been with the service for quite some time and worked your way up through the ranks of the division there. So give people just an idea of where you came from.
Sure. Well, I think a lot of folks in this field kind of grew up running around the woods in the backyard and chasing birds, and I was really no different. Some of my earliest childhood memories are out there hunting with my grandfather, and it's really that love of the outdoors and hunting and fishing has really shaped a lot of my career and education choices to date. Yeah, I did my undergraduate work at Virginia Tech, where I majored in wildlife science there, and really got my first exposure to working with wildlife and ducks and picking bugs and a few other things, black bears. But it was really when my time at LSU, Louisiana State University, where I really developed the passion for waterfowl research and migratory bird management. My graduate research was done down in Louisiana, and I kind of migrated with the birds, did my field work up in Saskatchewan, and so I'd spend spring and summers up in the Canadian prairies and winters down in Louisiana. So it was really the best of both worlds. But I started with the Fish and Wildlife Service back in 2003. Largely as a staff biologist in our harvest survey section at the time. I know, Mike, I think you've already talked to Kathy Fleming and Paul Padding on a prior podcast about our harvest surveys and the harvest information program. So Paul was actually one of the ones that hired me into the service back in 2003 to really help improve our harvest survey program. After a few years, I became chief of that branch, and worked hard again to continue that cooperative survey that we have with the states and hunters. After some time there in harvest surveys, I moved over as chief of our population and habitat assessment branch, where we were really analyzing a lot of the survey data and doing a lot of the assessment work that fed into a lot of the population models and hunting regulations. So I spent about 5 or 6 years as chief of that branch, and then moved on to be deputy division chief for the Division of Migratory Bird Management. And for about the last 2.5 years now, I've been division chief for Migratory Bird Management, located in our headquarters office, right in Washington, D.C.
Ken, that's a great track record. That's a great perspective that such a track record brings with it for you to be in the position that you're in now. And a lot of times when I reconnect with friends and colleagues in our age bracket, I can't help but reflect on earlier conversations where people say, well, you're going to be in 10 or 15 years, you people are going to be the ones in these positions making these decisions, and you just never at that time really allow yourself to think about that becoming reality. It's like, oh no, no way, I'm not going to be able to fill the shoes of that person or whoever was there. And so I'm not saying that we are necessarily filling the shoes of those people that came before us, but those things did hold true, and that we are now among those that are in those positions and filling the duties of the people that we respected and looked up to long before us. And so it's just it's interesting and humbling to reflect on that at times. And your path is a perfect example of that, and the way you've moved up and the great work that you've done in the process. So thanks for all that.
Well, thank you, Mike. I just can't believe the last 20 years have seemed to go by in the blink of an eye. And you're absolutely right. You and I have been very fortunate to come into the waterfowl management enterprise and really get to stand on the shoulders of some of the giants in this field and continue their conservation legacy. So it's great to be a part of that long history.
Ken, I can't go very much farther in this conversation without expressing on behalf of Ducks Unlimited, our entire organization across all three countries, a special thanks to you for you and the entire service and your division for the work that you've done for many, many years, managing and helping sustain healthy populations of waterfowl and enabling a sustainable harvest of those species. And that really falls squarely on the division over which you lead at this time, the Division of Migratory Bird Management. So in the interest of connecting a few dots, we say thank you for all of that work. We want to connect a few dots for people, as you've kind of already referenced here. There are a number of branches within that division. So briefly just list those so that our hunters, our conservationists, others that are listening can begin to get a picture for what actually happens within the division that you are overseeing at this time.
Sure, I'd be happy to. But first, Mike, I might want to just pick up where you left off. You wanted us to thank the service for all that we do. And I'd really like to take the opportunity to thank Ducks Unlimited and many of the other partners that are out there. We don't do anything in isolation here in the Fish and Wildlife Service. We do it in collaboration with NGOs like Ducks Unlimited and others. We work very closely with the Canadian Wildlife Service and many, many state natural wildlife research agencies and provincial agencies. So we do nothing in isolation, and we're all about partnership and trying to achieve collaborative migratory bird management in North America. And like I said, we're just a smaller part of that overall Fish and Wildlife Service is a smaller part of that overall wildlife management enterprise. As far as the migratory bird program in the Fish and Wildlife Service, we have two divisions. Well, one of the divisions that we have is Division of Migratory Bird Habitat Conservation, or the Division of Bird Habitat Conservation. And this is the side of the house that really deals with the habitat issues. They administer the North American Wetland Conservation Act grants, the Neotropical Migratory Bird Conservation Act. They oversee some of the bird initiatives, such as the North American Waterfowl Management Plan and JVs. And I know really do a lot of work on the habitat side, and I know DU's a big partner in that, and we appreciate that everything you do with the knock-a-dollar matches and just a lot of great work done there. So my division is actually the Division of Migratory Bird Management, and we largely deal with the population side of the house. Everything that we do, we largely get our authority under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and we're responsible for the administration or implementation of that act relative to the take of migratory birds. So the MBTA basically bans the take of migratory birds unless specifically authorized by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or Department of Interior. So what my division does is we are really geared towards authorizing the take of migratory birds. Hunting season is certainly one way that we do that. And another way that we do that is through permitting. But we really want to ensure that take is commensurate with population status. So our division is really set up with a whole bunch of different branches to be sure that we have the information that we need to responsibly manage migratory birds in the United States and really North America. So in the division, we actually have 4 branches. One of which is very relevant to the conversation that we're talking about here today with May surveys. We have the branch of migratory bird surveys, and this is our group of pilot biologists pilots. We have 10 folks in that branch and about 12 aircraft in the division. Not very many people know that we do have a small airline here in the Fish and Wildlife Service, but these guys are really our eyes in the skies and fly the surveys for us each year, as well as conduct some of the banding operations that we have. And we have several folks in that branch, too, that provide us a lot of policy advice and also ensure that we're doing the best we can with aviation safety and also making investments into remote sensing. So a very important branch for us. Another branch we have in the division is the branch of monitoring and data management. I think you talked to Kathy Fleming a while back.
Yep, we did.
Chief of that. Yep, she is chief of that branch. And I think you specifically with Kathy about harvest surveys and the harvest information program, that collaborative state federal program that we do. But Kathy actually has a lot more responsibilities than that. So Kathy also oversees the data analysis from not only the May survey, but also many of our other surveys that we do, such as the Woodcock Singing Ground survey and some of the crane work and other population surveys that we have. And Kathy's group is also responsible for putting together the waterfowl status report that everyone eagerly awaits every year, as well as status reports for many of our other species that we have as well. And then another function of Kathy's branch is, we've been conducting these surveys, as you mentioned, since 1955, and we have quite a data set, as you can imagine. And so Kathy's branch has also been giving a lot of thought to our data management and how to make that data accessible to the public and academics and NGOs and other folks that would like to use them. So the branch of monitoring and data management. Another branch that we have in the division is the branch of assessment and decision support. This is headed up by Pat Devers. And this is the group that takes a lot of the data and information that we get from our monitoring programs and really kind of meshes it with all of our partners and objectives and puts things in a decision frameworks for us, population models, to really do the assessment work that we need to support different levels of take in the U.S. And these are the folks that work on the adaptive harvest management models with the flyways, that kind of looks at the impacts that our hunting regulations have on actual harvest and also the impacts harvest has on population dynamics of different species. So that, again, is a really important branch for us to do that assessment work to be sure that we do meet our responsibilities under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and just kind of ensure that harvest or any take that we authorize is compatible with the status of that species.
Well, is that it, or do we have one more? It's easy for me to get confused on these occasionally because I know every now and then you go through some name changes. So do we have any others?
There is one more, and this one is just as equally important, and this is the branch of conservation permits and regulations. So this branch, for me, they deal with the permitting side of the house and really authorizing take for non-game species, such as to alleviate depredation events or scientific collecting type permits. They also do a lot of conservation work, put out guidance on how to reduce impacts to migratory birds and their habitats, such as like collisions with buildings or automobiles, really working with different industry sectors to again, anyone who wants to voluntarily reduce impacts to birds, we can provide guidance to them and some technical assistance. But a really function of that branch is the regulations piece. So we can do the best surveys in the world, the best assessment work from the other branches. If this isn't codified in regulations every year, we don't have hunting season. So one of the important roles that branch plays for us is putting together all the Federal Register documents where we codify the results of the surveys, the results of the assessment work, the adaptive harvest management model outputs, the work with the states and flyways into actual hunting regulations each year. So really, we all four branches in the division work pretty closely and are all necessary for us to achieve our goals.
You've got your hands full with all of those different branches, and some people may be thinking, "Hey, I wanted to listen to I tuned into this because I want to hear about the cancellation of the survey and what it's all going to mean." But I think this is important information because I want people to realize. I believe it's important for people to realize the number of people and the things that are in place within the Fish and Wildlife Service that all are important for managing this resource and enabling the harvest regulations that actually come out every year, and then how all that data is used. It's not a simple process, and a lot of people are involved in that, and appreciate you sharing that information.
Yeah, I would be remiss if I also didn't mention our flyway representatives. As I mentioned earlier, too, we don't really do anything in isolation here, and we really strive for collaborative migratory bird management in North America. And one of our biggest partners here are the flyway councils, or the states. And we do have 4 flyway representatives who act as our primary liaisons between the Fish and Wildlife Service and the flyway councils. So also very, very important to get the perspectives of states and to be sure that their interests are represented and brought forth as well. So
a very good point to bring that out as well, because that's the other key part of this, and that's the role that the states play through the flyway system in helping to provide recommendations for harvest regulations every year, and we'll have a conversation about that as well one day and how all that works. And so a number of key players, all of which are equally important in this annual process. And so of course this year we have something very different that's been thrust upon us, and that's what we really want to talk about here. Ken, I first want to start out just by talking about why the population and habitat survey is so important. You've touched on some of this already. It's used in setting waterfowl hunting regulations, but just from a big picture, when you describe the importance of this survey, how do you do it? What do you tell people? And what are the most important things that you want them to come away with?
Yeah, the May survey, it's really been one of the cornerstones of duck harvest management since the mid 1950s. As I mentioned earlier on, one of our major responsibilities under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act is to really ensure that any harvest that we allow is commensurate with population status. Or another way to put that is to be sure that harvest is compatible with the population's ability to maintain itself over time. And really one of the biggest pieces of information that we use to do that are the results from the May survey every year. So if you're just thinking about, just your basic population biology 101, there's several key pieces of information that you need to help manage populations. And one is certainly your population size that you have right now. And we get that information from May surveys. The other is how much recruitment that you have every year. How much you add to the population. And I know Kathy probably talked a little bit about the wing bees that we conduct every year.
Yep, she did.
And we get age ratios from that. And that's really one of our biggest indicators of recruitment every year on a population level, population scale. So that's another key piece of information that we use. And then another thing that we want is just how much we actually take every year. Or just mortality. And there's really 2 components to that. There's the hunting mortality that are a direct result of our regulations. And then there's also natural mortality. So those are all the key pieces of information that we really use to manage duck populations in North America, with population size being one of the big 3.
One of the other things I want people to realize, and I think it's important to point out, is, and this bears into the decision to cancel the survey, I'm going to guess, was the sheer scale of the survey. Now, people familiar with the survey will know there are 2 sort of common ways to refer to it, and these correspond to the survey areas, the coverage of them. There's the traditional survey area, which is largely what we call the mid-continent North America. It's the prairies of the U.S. into Canada, the western boreal forests on up into Alaska, and then the Arctic of northern Canada to some extent. And then there's the eastern survey area, which is, roughly, if you were to look at the Great Lakes and take the boreal forest of Canada to the east and a few states in the northeastern U.S. So we have the traditional survey area and the eastern survey area. But the scale of these areas, give people an idea of what we're dealing with there, Ken.
All right. Yeah, these surveys are huge. They're not your average survey. I mean, they extend, as you mentioned, in the traditional survey area from South Dakota, Montana, North Dakota, all the way up through the bush to Alaska and the territories, Northwest Territories. So it is a huge expanse of North America. And that traditional survey area comprises about, I think it's about 1.3 million square miles.
Wow.
That we survey every year. And then if you were to move over to the east, as you mentioned, that survey area includes the maritime provinces in addition to Ontario and Quebec, and then parts of New York and Maine. And the eastern survey area also covers about 0.7 million square miles. So between the two areas, we're surveying about 2 million square miles of breeding duck habitat each year in North America. And I know we fly about 80,000 miles of transects each year at 100 feet, at about 100 miles an hour, counting ducks and assessing habitat.
That's truly remarkable. It's truly remarkable. There's a reason why within the wildlife conservation and management community, many people oftentimes point to this survey as the largest, longest running landscape scale wildlife survey in the world. Now, there are going to be critics of the survey. There's critics of any kind of effort that we do. And I think even some studies have demonstrated that, for some species, it's not perfect every year, but no survey is going to be, especially when you're operating at this massive scale. And again, it's not a census. It's a statistically based survey. And that's the way we have to do it, because you can't count every duck or goose that exists on 2 million square miles. So it is clearly the most extensive wildlife survey, certainly in North America, and I would argue in the world as well. And it has been a phenomenal resource to the North American waterfowl management community, and is one of the key reasons why we have been so successful at managing populations at sustainable levels as we have. So it's just tremendous. And a number of air crews and ground crews. Talk a little bit about that, about just the personnel that go into this effort.
Yeah, so this is where our branch of migratory bird surveys kind of plays in. So in that branch, we do have 10 pilot biologists and about 12 different service aircraft. And each one of the pilot biologists gets paired up with an observer, usually from the Fish and Wildlife Service, but we have also had states participate in that. So we have these pilot and observer crews, and they're essentially simultaneously covering big part of the North America, surveying the prairie breeding ground, or the migratory bird duck breeding grounds. I think in total we have about at least 10 crews from Fish and Wildlife Service in my branch, and we also have 2 crews up in Alaska. So there's about 12 survey crews that it takes every year to complete the surveys. And they get started down in the south a little bit earlier, usually around the 1st of May. They're always timed based on the breeding phenology of the species. And some years it can be a little later, depending on weather. Some years it can be a little earlier, depending if spring progresses a little faster. And then they'll typically conclude up in the northern areas, often in mid-June. So it's a pretty big undertaking. And again, it kind of involves all of our people from around the country in coordination, flying these areas.
You described it as a pretty big undertaking. I think you're underselling yourself a little bit there, Ken. I could not imagine the amount of time that it would take if we had to start from scratch to try to implement something like this. Nowadays, if we started from scratch and did not have the long history of the gradual implementation and expansion and improvement, it's just, whenever I stop and think about it, you have the pilot biologists and the observers traveling to these remote locations, and it's not like they can just fly into a major airport everywhere they go. They're going to some incredibly remote locations. Some of these planes have floats on them, or at least I know they used to. I'm assuming you still have some float planes, and they will go into these very remote areas, and it just takes a level of coordination and cooperation that I think it's probably impossible for me to truly comprehend, but certainly from afar, I think a lot of people take it for granted. But when you start talking to some of the people that conduct the surveys, that fly the planes, go to these places, and understand the logistics that they have to line up every year, it's truly a testament to the commitment of all the different agencies and individuals that are part of this. Now, unfortunately, my equilibrium does not allow me to fly. That's something I inherited from my mom in these small planes. I lose my stomach, every time I try it. So I have not had the fortune of being an observer, certainly not a pilot. No one would want that on any of these surveys. but there are also ground crews. Now, that's something that I could probably do. So talk a bit about the ground crews that are involved in this and how many of those there are.
Sure. So, we're like I said, it is a huge undertaking every year, as you mentioned, and the logistics that goes into it and the planning is pretty unbelievable. We're also very fortunate to have lots of partners in this endeavor, and as you know, as we mentioned earlier, Canadian Wildlife Service is kind of front and center right there with us, and make a lot of this possible, especially since a lot of the flying is done north of the 49th parallel. So we're really happy to have them as partners, as well as several different states that also conduct their state surveys, and their information gets wrapped up into our estimates as well. So it is a huge undertaking of many different agencies and partners. So kind of getting back to your question about the ground survey there. Obviously, we know even the best of folks can't see all the ducks from the air, especially when you're flying at 100 miles an hour and 100 feet. You're going to miss some. And so what we actually do to try to get a better estimate of ducks is go out there and we run several segments that what we call air grounds. And I don't remember the exact number off the top of my head right now, but there's somewhere along the tune of about 20 to 30 air grounds across the U.S. and Canadian prairies, where we send out a ground crew to go out there and count ducks on some of the same transects that the planes are flying over. And then we actually compare counts from the air crew and the ground crew, and we kind of use that to develop correction factors for a lot of our estimates too. So it actually gives us a better idea, or estimates of duck production, or estimates of duck numbers are actually a lot more realistic when we do correct them for a number of birds that would be missed by the air crews. So we do ground crews in the U.S. prairies and Canadian prairies, and then we use helicopters in the east and some of the bush areas to help develop those visual correction factors.
How many ground crews do you have, and how many people are part of that? Do you know? Have that figure off the top of your head?
I know in the U.S. that we're responsible for two. We typically have one for the eastern Dakotas. They would be the eastern half of North and South Dakota, and then we have another crew out in the western part of the Dakotas in Montana. And then Canadian Wildlife Service, I also believe, has 3 or 4 crews that do the air grounds across Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. And each crew has anywhere from between, 2 and 4 people that kind of run around and look at birds. Try to get an accurate count of the number of birds that are there. And then, it's all georeference, where you can compare all this with the air crew's numbers. They're usually flown or done around the exact same time, or shortly after the air crew flies over, and really does do a pretty good job of helping us develop visual correction factors for what the air crew misses.
Be the first to know when ducks are on the move. Sign up for DU's waterfowl migration email alerts and receive ongoing in-depth updates on the latest habitat conditions, weather changes, and hunting reports for your flyway. Visit ducks.org/migration alerts.
I want to transition now to the decision to cancel this year's survey, but all of that information that we've just discussed is an important backdrop to this conversation, because it's not just 1 or 2 groups of people that are going out there conducting these surveys. You've got dozens of people. You got multiple crews that are all across this landscape and that are moving around. It's not like they go to one location and they're there for a month. They're moving around to conduct this survey across this 2 million square mile area. And all of that factors into some of the decisions that I'm sure the logistical challenges that you guys were encountering as you were beginning to think about whether you could actually conduct this survey. Now, we've talked about the collaborative nature of this survey, and it's not just the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service involved in it. And actually, as I was watching my email as we got into the COVID-19 situation, I saw actually the Canadian Wildlife Service and maybe a few states were before the service signaling their decision to cancel their participation in the breeding population survey, as well as some other surveys, research studies in the Arctic, summer banding programs. And a lot of this just relates to, it's going to relate fundamentally to some of the travel restrictions that were being put in place by some of those countries, provinces, and states, and they were just not going to be able to allow where the travel was not going to be allowed. So it wasn't an option. And so they had to make that decision. And then I believe the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was one of the last one of the last to come out and say, all right, we've thought about this. We're not going to be able to pull this off even in the States. And so there were a lot of things that went through all of this, went through your decision making. So let's talk about that. What really were you having to think about with respect to that particular decision?
There are certainly lots of moving parts, and all these parts kind of need to align each year for us to pull off a successful survey, and that's no small task. I think what really went into this decision was really to ensure the human health and safety of not only the air crews and ground crews and other members of Fish and Wildlife Service and Canadian Service staff, but also just members of the North American public. As you mentioned earlier, we have lots of folks moving all over the continent, and just the potential spread of the coronavirus was certainly a big concern. But health and human safety, I think, really played into the decision, not only for the Canadian Wildlife Service, but us as well. That was really kind of front and center. And really what we do, every time we get up in an aircraft and turn a prop, we really need to balance the need for the mission with the associated risk. And this year, the risk not only to our crew, but other members of the North American public in Canada and the U.S. were high and in some cases unknown. So I think that was really one of the big things that went into the initial decision by the Canadian Wildlife Service and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The other big complicating factor here really too was things that were completely out of our control, like the State Department it wouldn't be the State Department, because the other big thing that was out of our control was just the border. I know Canada at that point had essentially closed the border to travel. With the exception of cases of COVID response or in cases of human health and safety. So it would have been very, very difficult for our pilots and our crews to actually transverse the border and cross the border to conduct the survey. So that also factored in greatly to our decision. One of the things that we did explore in some good detail too is even the utility of just doing a partial survey in the United States. So basically, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Montana, and then over in the east, we would have had Maine and New York. And we spent a fair bit of time looking at the utility of doing that to see if any information could be gleaned from just doing a partial survey. But after exploring that for a week or two, the bad thing there, I guess, is a lot of our population models and decision frameworks for setting harvest in North America, or at least in the U.S., are based on population level estimates. And in many cases, they're North American level estimates. And just surveying a segment of that breeding population would have introduced and created a lot more biases than we knew how to deal with at the time. So, really, decision was made at that point just to rely on other alternatives to help get the information that we need, rather than trying to attempt a partial survey.
One of the things that occurred to me as I'm listening to you here, Ken, is that it's the first time I really even thought about this with respect to the partial survey. Unless things have changed, and you tell me if this is if I'm wrong here, but the AHM matrix, not sure if that's exactly what it's called, but the matrix of population size and pond conditions that's a key factor in selecting liberal, moderate, or restrictive seasons. It uses the pond count is based only on Canadian ponds, right?
That is correct. And that's largely just a function of us having a longer time series of that pond information in Canada. But that is another key piece that factors in our decision. And I know we've been fortunate enough to use some other metrics to give us an idea of what conditions might be this year, and that will also help us inform some decisions going forward.
Well, that's true. Like everything you hear, whether it be on the news, daily conversations, or even within the organizations and agencies with which we work, we talk about how, when we come out of this, we're going to be doing things a bit differently. We will have learned, we will have improved, and that's going to be definitely true for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and your partners as well with respect to some of the data, collected through this survey. Maybe there's some ancillary data. Maybe there's some different ways of collecting the data. I'm sure all those types of thoughts are going to be going through your mind as well. So, how high in the service did these discussions go? Well, who all were involved in the in the decisions?
A lot of the decision rested within the Division of Migratory Bird Management and Migratory Bird Program. We tried to look at several different alternatives on how we could, like I said, conduct a partial survey. We looked at some of the constraints that we were trying to operate under with the border being closed. We were almost in daily communication with the Canadian Wildlife Service, our Canadian counterparts. What we tried to do is come up with some different alternatives this year on not only, could we conduct a partial survey and get estimates, but also how we were going to make harvest management decisions in the absence of this information. So essentially, we came up with a plan and presented those to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service director, really a skip with, and briefed her. And I know she concurred with our assessment. At that point, it was just, I think, easier to, given the fact that a lot of our harvest strategies did operate at that population level, the North American level, it would have just been very difficult to try to piece together information from partial surveys. And really, at that point, the risk of flying the mission wasn't worth the reward.
Yeah, well, it sounds like a prudent decision to me. And the important thing to emphasize, one of the many important things to emphasize, is that we have 65 years worth of data. It's not like we don't understand a lot about these waterfowl populations in North America. And I feel confident saying you guys were confident that we could still make informed decisions even absent current year's data. And so with that, I want to transition to what does all of this mean? What does it mean with respect to, we have this missing data point, right, that I just referenced. We're not really concerned about how that missing data point would affect our ability to sustain waterfowl populations. We know tons about this resource. We have great understanding of how harvest affects these populations. So we're not really worried about that. At least I'm not, and I know no one within Ducks Unlimited is. But with respect to hunting regulations this year and into the future, that's probably where a lot of people have some questions. Maybe there's some uncertainty. But let's set a few things straight. The first thing I want to get out of the way is for the 2020-2021 hunting season, that hunting season that's coming up. Let me just pose this question straight out to you, Ken. Is the cancellation of the survey this year going to have any bearing on the hunting seasons for this coming year?
None whatsoever. So the hunting seasons for the 2020-21 seasons, or the seasons that we'll be having this fall, those are actually based on a lot of the information that we collected back in 2019. So last year's breeding population and harvest survey information. So back around 2015, I believe, the service made a change in how we issue the annual hunting regulations each year. And around the 2015 time period, we actually started setting regulations essentially a year in advance. So kind of using predictions already about what the population would be that next year, and then essentially setting hunting seasons based on that prediction. So the information for this fall, like I said, primarily came from the 2019 breeding population habitat survey.
Okay, so we should be good for this coming hunting season. And if I'm not mistaken, we're recording this during like the third week of May, and a lot of those hunting regulation proposals have already gone out. I think they're in the hands of the states now. The states are making their recommendations, and so those should be finalized pretty soon, right? Are we pretty far along in that process, right?
We are pretty far along in that process. So I know the final frameworks for the waterfowl regulations in the U.S. Should be publishing here in the next month or so. And then once those final frameworks hit the street or are established, the states then have the ability to select their seasons within those frameworks. So that process actually started back in April of 2019.
Wow.
And then so that's when we had the initial kind of kicked off that regulation cycle for the 2020-21 hunting season. And then last October, I know we had the Service Regulations Committee meeting where we heard the technical recommendations for what the season should be for that 2021 hunting season. So those are kind of almost in the books and done, and are kind of completely unimpacted by our ability not to fly the survey this spring.
Well, Ken, I know one thing. I will be glad when we're beyond the 2020 2021 timeframe, because that's a mouthful and it's hard for me to keep straight. So
yeah, me too.
let's transition to the season that is really that's really the focus of the conversation. And that would be the 21-22 hunting season, a year and a half out from now. What does the service, and I know y'all have developed some talking points related to this. You didn't just cancel the survey absent any type of thinking about, well, what are we going to do in its place? So what are we thinking at this time with respect to the 21-22 hunting seasons and how you'll go about setting those regulations, recognizing, as you've said, that they would have been the regulations set based on breeding population and habitat data that would have been collected this year?
Yeah, I'll gladly touch on that. And it kind of goes back to a comment you made just a minute ago, Mike. And we are very, very lucky, at least in the waterfowl management world and the duck management world, that we do have these long-term data sets. You know, as you mentioned, we've been conducting the waterfowl breeding population and habitat survey every year since 1955. You know, we've been conducting a lot of our harvest surveys each year since 1961. Banding, this is the centennial of the bird banding lab this year over in USGS. So we are incredibly fortunate just to have a wealth of information and over such a long time period. So we have just learned a ton about the resiliency of waterfowl, how to predict waterfowl population dynamics. So what really we're going to do is use these long-term data sets to help us predict population abundance, population growth rates, harvest, and really get some of these underlying metrics that we need to make a good decision every year. So there'll certainly be a little bit more uncertainty associated with our decisions, but I don't think we're at all worried about any impact that it will have on waterfowl populations overall. So. I mean, most populations are at very healthy levels right now and can sustain harvest levels that we previously have had in place.
Yeah. Are there any species for which regulatory options for the 21-22 season might be less certain?
Oh, there's a few, I think, that might give us a little bit of concern. I'll go ahead and mention a couple of those species. And one is the Atlantic population of Canada geese that do nest up on the Ungava Peninsula each year in Canada. And I know Atlantic Flyway has seen some more restrictive regulations here in recent years because that population has had very, very poor production over the last 3 years. So it's kind of unfortunate that we don't have the population information from that species or that population. There's also some others out there too, where we don't have as liberal regulations on scop or pintails as well. So those are ones that we'll especially attention to, or pay a special attention to going forward. So we won't make any of these decisions in isolation either. We'll work pretty cooperatively with the flyway councils to really develop a plan for addressing missing data as us canceling May surveys. I know we'll have initial discussions with the flyways. Well, actually, we already did have initial discussions with the flyways last month at the April Service Regulations Committee meeting. And then we committed to working collaboratively with the flyways here this summer, and we'll present some options to them on how to move forward at their summer flyway meetings, which will typically take place in July. And we'll work together to essentially use the existing harvest strategies that we have in place, the existing objectives that we have in place, and the existing data we have in place to make good, scientifically based, defensible decisions going forward.
So, Ken, is it fair to say that what you're thinking is that we're going to use our understanding of waterfowl population dynamics and harvest effects on those populations to predict what breeding duck populations would have been this year, and then run those numbers through the typical adaptive harvest management process? Is that what we're thinking?
Yep, that's in essence exactly what we're proposing to do, and there might be tweaks, with that after consultation with the flyways. But we already have several population models in existence that do to predict what populations might be given any level of harvest and different conditions. So we have a lot of the infrastructure there already through the adaptive harvest management process. And it would really just be a matter of taking our anticipated population size that we're going to get based on examining some of these long-term data sets and kind of running it through the existing AHM machinery So we're really not expecting too many big changes here for the 21-22 hunting season.
But that's an important point, and I know that language is consistent with some of your talking points, and we're really not expecting any major changes from year to. And it's rare that we would see that anyway. Even when we have this data, it's rare that we see waterfowl populations or habitat conditions make tremendous jumps, certainly across the board. And so there's typically been a fair degree of stability from one year to the next, save some exceptions, and those would be the species or situations around which there may be more uncertainty at this given time. But yeah, that was one of the things that I took as well from your talking points, is we shouldn't expect too many changes. I know we're going to have to start wrapping this up here pretty soon, Ken. So just a couple of additional questions here. Is there any reason for hunters to think that a 21-22 season might be in jeopardy by the survey not being flown this year?
Not at all. Like I said, we fully intend and expect allow hunting for the 21-22 hunting season. We've already kicked off that regulations process with the April Service Regulations Committee meeting that we had last month. And as you mentioned, Mike, most populations there are pretty healthy levels and can sustain harvests that we've previously set in place. And, we're really not anticipating too many changes here. And we will work closely with the flyways and kind of identify appropriate measures for some of the species of concern. But again, we're not really expecting at this point too much to be different.
Do you, at this time, I know there's some uncertainty with the pandemic and what it will look like a year from now, but assuming things have settled down, do you anticipate the survey resuming as normal next year, assuming things settle down?
Absolutely. I think, we're eager to get back to doing what we do best as soon as we possibly can. But I know at least right now we're kind of looking at things day to day and trying to make good decisions with the restrictions that we have in place. I know it's probably too early to speculate on what next spring might bring relative to this pandemic, but I'm hopeful that we'll have different measures in place that would allow us to continue the survey and get back to doing what we do best. So I think, I'm very, very hopeful that we'll be back on track later this summer and or next spring.
That's yet another thing for us all to look forward to, is the resumption of the waterfowl breeding population and habitat survey in 2021. My goodness, I know I will welcome that with open arms. Now, one of the things that we're going to be missing this year, I think, is the annual status report. Have you all talked at all about any type of sort of substitute publication, or is that not even really on the radar at this time?
We have. I still think we'll get some data, be able to glean some data from some of the limited information that we have. It'll certainly be an abbreviated status report. We'll be able to, again, at least report what we have. And I know the adaptive harvest management report that we'll put out this year will probably spend some time talking about, how we made decisions without some of this information that we have every year. So it's kind of a bit of a work in progress, but we'll be ready to communicate with hunters the best we can. And that's always tough. I've been involved in this survey, or this survey has been such an important part of my life for most of my life. And I think back and used to eagerly await, getting that the results of the status report that would come out every year in July, and just kind of get a glimpse of what hunting seasons might have to offer. So it's going to be real difficult not having that this year. I know it's important not only for me, but a lot of the other duck hunters out there as well. So, but we will get by.
That's an important annual timestamp for everyone that cares about waterfowl populations, waterfowl conservation. And so we'll have to look to something to fill that void, but I'm sure we will find it. It's just going to be a different year, like it has been in so many different ways. Now, one thing that I wanted to say here is that it's not just the waterfowl population survey that was canceled. There are other banding operations that are likely going to be canceled. Research operations in the Arctic have been canceled. The breeding bird survey, the USGS, is one of the lead agencies responsible for kind of coordinating that. It was also canceled. So the pandemic has affected a number of large-scale, long-term bird population data collection efforts. It's had far-reaching effects on everything we do. And I'm not telling people anything they don't already know. But Ken, I know some of these decisions have yet to be made. You've talked about what you think is going to happen, and we really appreciate that. Appreciate the service developing the talking points and laying out, communicating to us all what we think is going to happen. Now, those, like I said, those decisions have yet to be made. Once they're made, would you be willing to come back on and talk with us about how things actually played out and what we'll be looking at whenever that time comes?
Oh, certainly would be. I always have enjoy having the opportunity to sit down and interact with you, Mike, and some of our partners, and then also being able to reach out to the duck hunters out there. It's just every time I do chat with hunters, it just amazes me just how passionate they are and how conservation minded they are, and any information that I can give them to help them out is something I strive to do. So I'd certainly be willing to sit down and chat with you or Ducks Unlimited again as we progress through this era of uncertainty. Yeah,
no kidding. Well, Ken, you have been incredibly generous with your time. I appreciate you getting on the phone. It is not, you're a busy person. And so for us to be able to take an hour and 15 or so minutes out of your schedule, that's greatly appreciated on my part and everyone within the community that's going to hear this, I know. So thank you so much for that. Any final words for the listeners that you might want to leave us with?
Yeah, I mean, again, I guess, in kind of looking at some of the internet chat rooms and Facebook pages, there does seem to be a lot of worry about how this could impact hunting opportunity in the U.S. And if I want to leave folks with anything, it's just the fact that we do have ways to make these tough decisions in the absence of data. And I really don't see this impacting folks' hunting opportunity in the U.S. And again, we look forward to working with the states and our other conservation partners for conservation of waterfowl and providing some of these opportunities.
I'm sure that's music to the ears of so many waterfowl hunters across the U.S. And so thanks for sharing that. Thanks to every one of your staff for the work that they do on an annual basis, many of whom I know personally and have spoken with already and plan to speak with others in the future. But thanks again, Ken, for your time. Thanks for your effort. Thanks for joining the Ducks Unlimited podcast.
Appreciate the opportunity, Mike. Thanks.
We extend a very special thanks to our guest on today's show, Dr. Ken Richkus, the Chief of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Division of Migratory Bird Management. We greatly appreciate Ken spending a fair bit of time with us talking about the MACE survey, the Waterfowl Breeding Population and Habitat Survey, and importantly, the decision that was made this year to cancel that survey, as well as the implications of that decision for the upcoming waterfowl hunting season, as well as hunting season in 21-22. We learned a great deal and appreciate his insights and him spending the time with us. Likewise, we thank our producer, Clay Barrett, who does a great job editing these episodes and getting those out to you. And you, the listeners, we thank you, as always, for the time that you spend with us, for choosing this podcast. And most importantly, we thank you for your support, passion, and commitment to wetlands and waterfowl conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.